kindergarten. Today we're starting a brand new unit and it is all about Native Americans. But I'm going to start by showing you this map of the world. Now there are many different continents in the world. I'm going to show you them right now. We have Antarctica, Australia, Asia, Africa, Europe, South America, and North America. These are all huge areas in the world. And in those continents, there are a lot of different countries. So in Asia, different countries could be China, or we learned about Japan with Momotaro. In Africa, there are all sorts of different countries too. There's Angola and Namibia. In Europe, there's France, there's Italy. In South America, there's Brazil and Argentina. And then in North America, one of the countries is the United States, right here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So we have South America down here and North America up here. And the United States is right in the middle, just here. We live in the United States in Washington, D.C. That's where that little blue dot is, right there. And it's actually exactly where I'm sitting right now because I got this picture off of Google Maps. So the circle right there is showing you where my apartment is in Washington, D.C. But the United States is a huge country that has a lot of different states in it. But we're not going to be talking so much about those states because we're going to be learning about the people who lived on this land first, before we did. First, we're going to start with some vocabulary words. Our first word is borrow. That means to take or use something for a while and then return it. So you might borrow a box of crayons from your cousin or your sibling, but in order for it to be borrowing, you'd have to give it back. Then we have coast. Now the coast is land right next to the sea or ocean. So you're on the coast if you go to Virginia Beach or you go to the Chesapeake Bay up in Maryland. There are a lot of different areas that are on the coast, really close to us. Deserts are large, dry areas of land with little rain. So this is a picture of the desert. It's covered in sand. And then we have roamed. Roamed means wandered. So if you see cows wandering around, we say they're roaming. And then we have tribes. We're going to be talking about this word a lot. But tribes are groups of similar people who share a language, common ancestors, customs, and laws. So there are many different tribes of Native Americans living all across the country, and they're pretty different from each other. So here's where our language gets really important. Over the next several days, you're going to be learning about Native Americans. And Native Americans were the first known people to live in the continents of North America and South America. Remember, we already talked about that on the map, but we have North America and South America. So Native Americans were the people who lived on those parts of the land very first before other people. There are other terms for Native American, though, that we really want to be aware of. Some people call Native Americans American Indians, or you might hear indigenous people. But remember, if we don't know what to call someone, we should always ask them what they prefer to be called. And many Native Americans prefer to be called by their tribe name. And in this unit, we're going to learn about different tribes. We're going to learn about the Lakota Sioux, the Wampanoag, and the Lenape tribes. So we're going to learn about a lot of different tribes, which is really cool. So we're going to hear in our books the terms Native American and American Indians, but remember, we're going to use those names, but when you're talking to someone, you should really use whatever they prefer to be called. It's very important to ask. So one interesting thing is that there are a lot of different tribes, and these tribes had different ways of living. So different tribes might eat different foods, they might dress differently, they might live differently, depending on where they live in South or North America. Just like think about how you would dress and eat differently if you lived all the way in the north where it was very cold. You might dress differently. Here in DC, it gets really hot in the summer, but in other places in the world, it doesn't. And so people would have to dress differently and might eat different food. So today you're going to hear about many Native American tribes, but over the next several days, you're mostly going to hear about the Lakota Sioux, the Wampanoag, and the Lenape. Okay. You're also going to see this chart. We're not going to fill it out yet, but you're going to see this chart on Seesaw, and you're going to talk about your environment, clothing, food, and shelter. Okay, I'm pretty sure you're really ready to get started. So I'm going to have you look at this picture first. Even though there are many Native American tribes, every group or tribe has some similar needs because everyone needs food, everyone needs clothing, everyone needs shelter to stay alive. But every tribe we're going to learn about has its own way of eating, dressing, and living depending on where it lived. Remember, different places have different types of weather, just like in this picture. So in DC, it might get really hot, but in Alaska, it might get really cold, like in Molly of Denali. So why do you think that the way we live affects what we might eat, the types of houses we might live in, and the kinds of clothing we wear? I want you to think about that as you hear what we're reading today, and you're going to finish talking about it in your Seesaw video. Okay, here we go. Long, long ago, before you and I can remember, long before your grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents can remember, there were no people living on the land we live on today. There were woods and plains, but no people. There were rivers and lakes, but no people. There were deserts and mountains, but no people. There were plenty of birds and fish, and animals and insects, but there were no people. But that was thousands of years ago, much earlier than any of us can remember. The first known people who lived in America, called Native Americans, or American Indians, or indigenous people, or whatever their tribe is, lived in all parts of the continent. Some lived in the desert, others lived in the mountains, some lived in the woods, and others lived on the coast near the ocean. People of the deserts lived very differently than people from the coast. Can you guess why that would be? You're going to learn about some of the different ways America's first known people, or Native Americans, live. Native Americans of long ago all needed the same things we need today. They needed food and water to stay alive. They needed shelter, so places to protect themselves from the weather and wild animals. And they needed clothing to keep themselves warm and dry. Now, the food of the deserts was not the same as the food of people who lived on the coast. And the houses that protected people from the woods didn't look the same as the houses of those who lived in the desert. Some people lived in teepees, some lived in weetus, some lived in hogans, some lived in pueblos, and others lived in longhouses. Native Americans of long ago had to rely on their knowledge of nature, of the earth, the plants, and the animals that surrounded them. And everywhere they roamed, these Native Americans found ways to borrow or use from the earth all that they needed to live. Some Native Americans grew their own vegetables and fruit. Others hunted buffalo. Some Native Americans hunted woodland animals. Others caught fish from rivers, lakes, and oceans. Some Native Americans cooked their food over an open fire, and others baked food in specially made ovens. The Native Americans also needed water, but there were no sinks with running water inside their homes. So where do you think the Native Americans found water long ago? Native Americans collected rainwater. They also got their water from lakes, rivers, and streams. Native Americans of long ago did not have cars and trucks. There were no buses or trains or planes, So how do you think they got around? Long ago, Native Americans traveled by foot, so they walked. There were no paved roads. Native American paths were made by the pounding of their own footsteps and the hooves of animal herds. After Native Americans were here for many years, they started riding horses. After that, some traveled on horseback, and others traveled in canoes. Those who lived in the woods used their feet to make their way through thick forests and trees. After many years, those who lived on open plains welcomed the speed of horses to carry them long distances, and those who lived near lakes and rivers relied upon canoes to carry them across the waters. No matter where they lived, Native Americans all made their own clothes. Some Native American women and girls wore skirts and dresses. Men and boys often wore breechcloths and leggings. They used materials from their surroundings to make clothes. Some Native Americans wore clothing made of animal skins, like elk, deer, buffalo, and rabbit. They often decorated their clothing with beads, porcupine quills, and fringe. During cold winter months, they wore coats of animal fur to stay warm. Others wore clothes made from soft inner bark of the cedar tree, sometimes decorated with seashells. Still others wore clothing made of fibers from different plants, cotton and yucca, and trimmed them with animal bones. In the winter, they covered themselves with cloaks to stay warm. Many men, women, boys, and girls in each of the Native American tribes across the land, from the ocean to the plains to the woods, wore moccasins on their feet. So, you see, the people who first came to live on this rich and varied land that we now call the United States of America were just as rich and varied as the land itself. They were alike in some ways and different in others, just as the people of America are today. Now, to be clear, this story talks like Native American people are from a long time ago. And it's true that indigenous means that they were the first people to ever live in North and South America. But there are still so many indigenous people still alive today. And we're also going to make sure we learn about indigenous culture today as well. So get ready to do your seesaw video and to talk about this video with Mr. Malcolm. Great job.